Welcome to Where Parents Talk. My name is Lianne Castelino. Our guest today is a housing policy researcher and adjunct professor at the University of Ottawa. Carolyn Whitzman is also an expert advisor to the Housing Assessment Resources Tools Project at UBC. She's an author and a mother of two, and she joins us today from Ottawa. Thank you so much for making the time.
Thank you, Lianne.
We are talking about a topic that is affecting families right across the country, certainly not just today, but for the foreseeable future in many cases. You have researched housing supply, demand, and policy for decades. How would you characterize the current housing situation in Canada?
Well, certainly we are in a crisis. There has been a market failure. One of the challenges, but also an opportunity, is that for a long time, housing was seen as a them issue. It was seen as an issue for poor people. It was seen as a temporary issue for students who then would move up the housing ladder. I think we're now moving to a consciousness that housing is an us issue, even for those of us, and I'm comfortably housed. I own a home. I have been through the experience of dealing with an elderly parent and trying to find a good place for her to receive long-term care. I have, through my children who are now adult, watched them go through much more stress and much more difficulty than I did when they were their age, finding suitable accommodation. So even from the perspective of my particular boomer household, comfortably housed, I've seen how the housing crisis is affecting young people, how it's affecting older people, and how it's affecting all of us.
It's such a multi-layered lens that you bring as you describe it there. I wonder, when you talk about your children, what frustrates you most or concerns you most, given all of the expertise that you have on the subject matter?
Well, I guess I'm most concerned about the notion of inherited wealth rather than meritocracy. So we're comfortably housed. We don't have the capacity to buy a house or pay part of a mortgage for our adult children. And I see my son considering leaving Ottawa, where I live, because he can't afford to get secure accommodation here. It's a slightly different situation with my daughter because she lives overseas, but certainly in her visits to Canada, she's been appalled at the housing situation here. So, as you get older, you start thinking, I would like to have grandchildren at some point, if the kids are up for it, which both of them are. And I would like to be close to those grandchildren. And it's seeming, from a selfish perspective, it's getting harder and harder for me to imagine that happening. So I really think that we need to start thinking about how we can be better parents and grandparents, how we can be better ancestors, and ensuring that housing outcomes work out for the next generation as well as they did for the generation that I was part of.
You've brought up so many important points in what you just said there. And I think what a lot of people might not think about often is the importance of housing. A lot of us just take it for granted. But if you were going to explain how and why housing is important, how would you go about doing that?
Well, I mean, housing is the basis for, if you look at Maslow's hierarchy, housing is a real basis of having secure the rest of your health, the rest of your life. So a lot of people become homeless and have housing issues because of physical and or mental health issues. But if you have insecure housing, it's so difficult for you to be able to take medications at a regular time, for you to feel good about yourself, for you to have a meaningful life. So it's the basis for the rest of our life. And it's also the basis for caring, at the extreme end. I've done work on violence against women, and a lot of women are reluctant to leave violent relationships because they're worried about not finding housing and potentially losing custody of their children. But even at a less extreme scenario, if you have to drive until you qualify for an affordable place, that's taking away on a daily basis life that you can spend with your growing family. And if you're reliant on a car to ferry your growing children everywhere, and they don't have an opportunity to explore the city for themselves or the countryside for themselves, then that is also depriving them of a very important part of their growing up and getting independence.
If you were to point to one or two as the main catalyst for how we have arrived at this housing crunch, what would they be in your estimation?
Well, there were two distinct points where we kind of went wrong. One of them was that immediately after World War II, the Canadian government acquired land, supported municipal governments to build adequate housing, and had a very clear sense of the populations that they were serving and how they could best be served. Now we can look back and go, yeah, they supported a certain amount of suburban sprawl, or yes, they probably overemphasized home ownership. And so they put a lot of resources into something that would lose affordability the first time. But the bottom line is we had 20, 30 years where housing was affordable to moderate income households, home ownership was affordable to moderate income households, and it was possible for young people to find affordable rent as they went to university, for instance. We started going wrong in the 70s when the capital gains tax was introduced and there was a principal residence exemption for your home. And although, in the abstract, that was intended to help people save towards their retirement, the emphasis on housing as an investment vehicle to help support your retirement as opposed to a place to live started fueling housing speculation, particularly when it was combined with less investment through tax rebates for purpose-built rental. The second point where we really went wrong as a country is in the late 1980s and early 1990s, as the federal government decided that housing policy was not their responsibility, and they downloaded it to municipalities. And certainly in the case of Ontario, the largest provinces downloaded to municipalities. So virtually no non-market housing was built. And since the beginning of housing policy in Canada, at least 100 years, there's been a recognition that low-income people, their needs aren't going to be met by the market. There does need to be community housing, co-op housing, public housing that can meet the needs of low-income people. So now what you have is housing that's about 3 or 4 times as expensive as it needs to be for moderate income people. So they're stuck in the rental market. You have low income people who are crowding for the same units in the rental market, and you have not enough purpose-built rental being built and not enough in the way of renter rights to make that stable housing, stable long-term housing. It doesn't need to be home ownership in order to be stable and secure housing, but unfortunately with our rental laws it is. And you have just, honestly, every time I speak to somebody, they have a horrible story. I was hearing a horrible story this morning about a middle income person who's really worried about what her old age is going to be, frankly. And I hear stories of people not having children because of lack of adequate housing, people getting divorced because of lack of adequate housing. The human cost of the housing crisis is just enormous.
When you look at some of the more telling statistics that you have come across that give you pause? Any rise to the top there where you say to yourself, like you just described, this is a 40 to 50-year-old issue that's been developing, but here we are now, post-COVID, and we've got this catastrophe on our hands, which has no easy, immediate fix. Is there a statistic in particular that you really find striking?
Well, there's a few statistics. There's one I've generated myself, which is 3 million households who are in need of homes that are $1,000 or less per month in housing costs. And that's virtually impossible to find right now. So 3 million households, that's about a fifth of households. And we count in certain ways. We don't count students. We don't count homeless people. We don't count people who need who are in group homes or in long-term care, et cetera. But when you start counting all those people, people who are commuting more than an hour, for instance, you end up with a very disturbing number, which is 3 million households who need that kind of housing in order to have decent, secure lives. I guess another statistic that sticks with me is that into the early 80s, the average home cost 2.5, maybe 3 times the average household income. Now across Canada, it's about 9 times. In Toronto, it's about 12 times. In Vancouver, it's about 14 times. So the homes have become so unaffordable that really it's only the top 10% who can afford to buy a home, and that's crazy.
So then what is it going to take to attempt to stem the current housing supply shortage in your view?
Well, there have been times in the past when there has been a shortage of affordable housing, and the Canadian government's been able to do something. I mentioned World War II when there was a huge housing shortage, and of course, a bunch of returning servicemen who would presume and women who would be presumably forming families. So between about 1943 and 1960, the government of Canada enabled 1.5 million affordable homes being built through a number of mechanisms, as I say, buying up big chunks of land, having pre-approved designs, supporting the building of very affordable small home subdivisions, etc. So Canada's done it in the past. Sweden built 1 million homes in a country that was a little bit less than 8 million people from 65 to 74. So there have been, Finland has virtually eradicated homelessness. There are contemporary examples of countries that are doing very well. There are historic examples of Canada having done a lot more during the mid 60s to the mid 80s. Between 10 and 25% of annual home completions were non-market homes that were aimed at low and moderate income households, which is sort of a baseline of where you'd want to be. So we've done it in the past. I believe we can do it in the future. We're richer than we used to be. We're at least as smart as we used to be. It's really a matter of political will.
Do you think that the scope, the breadth, and the depth of the housing crisis, which is not just not having enough supply, you've outlined all of the potential impacts across the lifespan that someone could experience. Do you think the impacts are fully well understood by everybody who needs to understand them?
Oh, absolutely not. So there's been a failure by all three levels of government. As I say, really, it's only the federal government that can lead a national response to what is essentially a national crisis. So the federal government has been very slowly wrapping its head around the notion of what needs to be done. And even in the last few years under the Liberal government, as it created a national housing strategy, and the first national housing strategy really in decades, a lot of the homes that it was supporting were simply not affordable, and it wasn't taking advantage of some of the levers in terms of taxation, in terms of infrastructure investment that it could do. The provincial governments have been horrible in general, with the possible exception of BC and historically Quebec. So they have not had social assistance or minimum wage rising. Like literally, if you're on minimum wage, you can't afford a place to live. If you're on social assistance, you really can't afford a place to live. And they also dropped the ball when the federal government handed it to them in terms of non-market housing. Municipalities have generally been more concerned with making wealthy homeowners allaying their fears about development rather than building the kind of well-located housing that's necessary. So there's been failure at all three levels of government, and that's helped create this crisis that we're in. I think things are changing very quickly. I think the discussions, for instance, about zoning, which is a very prosaic issue, but who can afford to live in well-located areas and how we can start building more carbon neutral and more accessible housing as well as more affordable housing through changing zoning and building codes. That's just exploded in the last couple of years. And to give the federal government credit, just in the last year, there's been a lot of leadership by the federal government in that area. But I think that we're still really wrapping our heads about what needs to be done.
Listening to yourself in terms of all the expertise you bring to this topic, it seems on some level that we're at this almost at the point of no return. So let me ask you, what kind of gives you hope in the short and medium term that this can be addressed with the speed and the thoughtfulness that it requires?
Well, I see that people getting more and more involved in housing organizations, whether they're Yes in My Backyard organizations or they are organizations to help people who are homeless. And I think that um, that sort of activism is very exciting to me. Um, Definitely, there have been examples, and one example is a federal initiative called the Rapid Housing Initiative that built a lot of housing quickly, but more importantly, I think, showed some of the ways forward. A lot of reliance on factory built housing. So we talk a lot about how there aren't enough people like a rapidly aging construction sector. But factory built housing has worked before for Canada, has worked before in other places like Sweden. I gave that example, and can work again. So we're starting to think outside the box again, which I find very heartening.
So what does that translate into if you're talking to young adults today? You talked about, having kids in in their 20s and early 30s in your case. I've got kids in my 20s. What would you say to them about what they can look forward to in the short term and the medium term, based on what the current situation is?
Well, there is going to be a federal election in the next, let's say, 2 years. There's going to be both provincial and municipal elections in Ontario in 26, which is coming up fairly soon. And I think it's really important that people get politically engaged. And, to really ask, the tendency is always for politicians to look for magic bullet solutions, less regulation, I don't know, first time home buyers grants or something like that. I would say it's really important for everyone, but particularly young people, to inform themselves about some of the solutions, to advocate collectively for those kinds of solutions, to ask politicians hard questions about what they're going to do to make sure that there's an adequate home for everyone so that everyone can have good lives and feel comfortable and supported in their decision to have children if that's their decision.
And on that note, when we're talking about young families, presumably young homeowners, or wanting to be homeowners, what do you see as some of the impacts on that demographic with respect to this current housing crisis?
Well, I'll be honest, Lianne, I would say that home ownership is not necessarily the best bet for a lot of people at this point. I think it's really important that we support the rights of renters for long leases. If you look at countries like Germany or Denmark or Austria or Switzerland, um, you have richer countries per capita than Canada that are also majority renter countries. And one of the differences between those countries and Canada is that renters aren't treated like second-class citizens. So I would say that I worry about some people who are getting very indebted and very over their head in terms of debt in order to own a home. And I understand completely why, because it is, you're looking for a place, you're feeling, I'm paying so much rent anyhow, but you don't want to be in a situation where you aren't able to make payments and you aren't in a situation, you aren't able to do anything else other than pay your mortgage, or that you're so far away where you're living that you aren't able to enjoy your life with your family if you have young children. So I'd say to young people, look at your options and advocate for the right options to support you into the future. And it might not be homeownership at this point.
So the lure that many of us of a certain generation have been sort of taught to appreciate, which is home ownership as the only goal. Are you saying that that really, this housing crisis has maybe kind of put a nail in the coffin of that kind of approach and thinking?
A nail in the coffin, and has also opened up other opportunities. I mean, there are other opportunities out there. In Germany, a lot of housing that's built is co-housing, where a number of households get together and build a set of shared apartments, let's say. Um, co-op housing was very strong for many decades, and hopefully it's coming back, where you don't have to buy a share like a condominium, but you also don't get a share when you leave. But having said that, you get secure accommodation, you get resident run accommodation, which is really important. I know it's somewhat presumptuous of me as a homeowner to say to other people that homeownership isn't the ideal, but I'd ask people to really think about what they're trying to achieve. And if they're trying to achieve a secure home where they're not worried about being evicted, then that's one thing. If they believe the thing that we were sold for a number of decades, which is that you'll own a house and then at some point you'll cash out and that will pay for your retirement, I'd remind people that people are living a lot longer, and certainly anecdotally, but also statistically, as people get older, they need more care. And a lot of people aren't able to fund their retirement through home ownership. So that might not be the best way to save towards your retirement. I know a lot of young people aren't necessarily thinking about their retirement, but home ownership is not a panacea. Um, home, you don't want to be in a situation where you're beating yourself up all the time about not being able to afford home ownership. I want to say it's not just you; it's the crisis that we're in. And I'm not saying that there is a situation. I mean, what would it take to make home ownership affordable again is a really important question. And prices would have to be at least half of what they are now, or they need to stay stable for a number of decades until household incomes doubled. And those are choices, and those choices would have problems attached with them. And there isn't a magic bullet. Let's put it that way.
What would you say to parents who perhaps are in the category of, owning their homes? They were raised a certain way, they worked, they paid their mortgage, and
Mhm.
now they have young adults in the house who are faced with the current situation. What would you suggest to them about how they can support that young person to navigate this current housing crisis?
It's really important to not make it about the individual. I think that there's parents who just don't really understand how much more difficult it is for this generation to own a home than it was for me. We bought our first home when our first child was 2, and we weren't paying more in mortgage than we were in rent, and the down payment was relatively low. the interest rates were relatively low at that particular time when we bought a home. I don't, those current conditions are not in place now. So, on an individual basis, you might want to put some money forward towards a down payment or something like that. But collectively, I think we as a society need to reckon with the fact that we need to change our attitude towards home. We need to stop, we need to seriously consider whether home is an investment, in which case I win and my children lose, or is home a place to live, in which case let's try to create the kind of society where everyone can win.
It's important food for thought, certainly, and maybe depending on the family or the background, might be a hard sell because you've been conditioned to think a certain way. And for many people, this has only been on their radar as a crisis in the last little bit. It seems to be,
Mm-hmm.
the only thing we're talking about. Has the pandemic had any impact on it at all?
Oh, I think so. So a whole bunch of things happened during the pandemic. A lot more people started working from home, and that created, again, a need for larger units because you were using a room as I am right now as an office. Another thing that changed during the pandemic was that there was a lot more readiness for people to move to Montreal or to Nova Scotia or to somewhere far away. And that's created a certain amount of tension, I think, since the immediate threat of COVID has abated, because some people have been asked to come back to work, and that makes it difficult. Um, so what we saw was, at least in the short term, rents became cheaper as people either fled cities in an old-fashioned plaguey kind of way. Students were not renting, etc. And then home prices went way up as the importance of home became even more clear. So yeah, it's certainly in the last little while since COVID that the importance of home has really been reinforced.
How does one know if they're house poor?
Ooh, if you so Canada has the highest level of household debt in the world. If you are worried about not making mortgage payments, if you are finding difficulty in furnishing your house, if you feel that every single expenditure that you're making is towards the maintenance of your home, such that you can't have holidays and you can't have vacations and you're stressed all the time, then you're house poor.
What does the conversation look like with your kids, if you ever have it or have had it, I'm sure in the past, when it concerns housing? What does that sound like?
So, what do the Whitesmans talk about? We just went on a little family road trip, which was fun. We talked about housing, as we often do. Um, and in a way, I'm not sure I want to say, because some of it's a bit brutal. Like, for instance, with our son, who is now living very far away from his work, we were suggesting, rather than him put all of his savings into a condominium, which he was considering, we said, get a car instead. And in a very brutal way, I said, well, you can live in your car, but you can't drive your condo. So that was a bit of a brutal conversation that we had. Um, I'd say in general, we're saying to our kids, you need to be able to feel comfortable with the choices that you're making. I have seen situations, not necessarily with my own children, but with other people's children, where they just are so overwhelmed in debt that it creates a lot of stress in their lives and mental health stress. Because another thing that happened, of course, during COVID is that it did no favors for anyone's mental health. So, don't beat yourself up is another thing that I say with them. If you're not able to achieve entirely arbitrary life goals by a certain point in your life, you take as long as you need to study, you take as long as you need to find the right job, etc. So I just, when I'm talking with my children, who are both wonderful people, I try to emphasize that they're frankly facing a very different world in a lot of ways from the world that we faced when we were their age. And I mean that about climate change. I mean that about a whole bunch of issues that concern me.
Dr. Carolyn Whitzman, lots of food for thought, housing policy researcher, adjunct professor at the University of Ottawa. We really appreciate your time and your insight today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lianne.